Think about this for a second. You're only 14 years old, barely 5 feet tall, so small that you still play marbles with your little sister. Then one day, you're accused of murdering 2 young girls. In less than 3 months, you're tried, convicted, and sentenced to die in the electric chair. This isn't fiction. This is a true story of George Stinney Jr., the youngest person executed in the United States during the 20th century. Welcome back to the Serial Crime Chronicles. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button now. Stay updated on shocking true crimes that rarely see the light of day. Stick with us till the end as we uncover another chilling mystery. In this true crime series, we'll unravel one of America's most shocking miscarriages of justice. We'll look at the brutal murders that sparked the case, the rushed investigation, the one-day trial, and the haunting execution. But most importantly, we'll uncover how, 70 years later, George's name was finally cleared. Stay with us, because by the end of this story, you'll be forced to ask, was George truly guilty, or was he just a child condemned by prejudice? The year is 1944. The world is in the middle of World War II. But in the small mill town of Alcaloo, South Carolina, the war feels far away. Life here is simple but harsh. Families work at the lumber mill. Children play along the railroad tracks, and everyone knows everyone else. Yet, the town is deeply divided. Train tracks don't just carry goods. They symbolize the rigid segregation of the Jim Crow South. White families live on one side, with their own schools, churches, and neighborhoods. Black families live on the other, confined to fewer opportunities and constant discrimination. It is in this world that George Stinney Jr. grows up. George is just 14 years old, but small and skinny for his age, barely 95 pounds, standing around 5 feet tall. He lives with his parents and siblings in a modest company house near the black section of town. By all accounts, George is quiet, polite, and helpful. He likes to draw, tends to animals on the family property, and spends time with his younger sister, Aim. On the afternoon of March 23, 1944, George and Aim are playing outside near the road. That's when 2 young girls, 11-year-old Betty June Binnicker and 7-year-old Mary Emma Thames, ride by on their bicycles. The girls stop and ask George and Aim if they know where to find maypops, a type of local wildflower. George points them in the direction. The girls thank them and ride off. It's the last time anyone sees them alive. That evening, when Betty June and Mary Emma don't come home, their families panic. By sundown, search parties are formed. Men comb the fields, the ditches, and the paths near the railroad tracks. Neighbors call out their names. Then, on the morning of March 24th, the search ends in horror. The 2 girls are found in a shallow ditch, their bicycles lying nearby. Both have suffered severe head injuries, beaten by what appears to be a heavy, blunt object. The crime is brutal, especially shocking because the victims are children. The town is gripped with fear and outrage. Who could have done this? It doesn't take long for suspicion to fall on George. Why? Because he and his sister were the last ones to see the girls alive. A neighbor claims George mentioned to someone that he had seen the girls earlier. That single detail is enough for the sheriff to act. Later that same day, deputies arrive at the Stinney home. They tell George's parents they need to take him for questioning. But here's the chilling part. His parents are not allowed to go with him. His mother and father are forced to stay behind as police take their terrified 14-year-old son away. George's younger sister Aim, who witnesses the moment, later recalls. They took George away in a car. He looked so scared. That was the last time I ever saw my brother. The small boy is escorted to the local jail. And from that moment, George Stinney Jr. is completely alone. Now here's a crucial question. Could George, a frail, undersized child, really have committed such a crime? The girls were older, stronger, and bigger than him. To overpower not one, but 2 of them, beat them to death, and drag their bodies into a ditch, it's almost impossible to imagine. Yet, in the racially charged atmosphere of 1940 South Carolina, logic takes a backseat to prejudice. A brutal crime has been committed. The town demands justice, and law enforcement believes they have their suspect. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button now. Stay updated on shocking true crimes that rarely see the light of day. Stick with us till the end as we uncover another chilling mystery. George is placed in a small room at the jail. No lawyers present. No parent. No guardian. It's just a frightened child against several white law enforcement officers. Hours later, the sheriff announces that George has confessed. But here's the catch. No written confession exists. No signed document. No recorded testimony. The alleged confession lives only in the words of the officers. They claim George told them he killed the girls because he wanted to have sex with Betty June, and when she resisted, he attacked her with a railroad spike. This so-called confession becomes a cornerstone of the case. But was it really his? Or was it the product of fear, intimidation, or outright fabrication? When word spreads that George has been arrested, the town's anger turns into hatred. Crowds gather outside the jail. Tensions boil so dangerously that George's parents are forced to flee town with their other children, fearing for their lives. George is left completely isolated. No family, no support, and no chance to defend himself. In just 24 hours, the case against George Stinney Jr. is all but sealed. The murders of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames had shaken Alcaloo to its core. The town wanted answers, and the police claimed they had them. But behind the headlines, troubling questions lingered. Could a 14-year-old boy really have committed such a brutal double murder? Where was the physical evidence? And how reliable was a confession taken from a scared child alone in a jail cell? We'll look deeper into the interrogation, the investigation, and the shocking speed with which George was charged. Stay with us. A 14-year-old boy alone in a jail cell. Hours of questioning. No parents, no lawyer. By the end of it, police claim he confessed to murder. But was it the truth, or just the story they wanted to hear? We saw how 14-year-old George Stinney Jr. was arrested after the bodies of two young white girls were found in a ditch in Alcaloo, South Carolina. His arrest was based solely on the fact that he was the last person to see them alive. Now, with George behind bars, the focus shifts to the investigation. But what unfolds in the days that follow will highlight just how fragile and how deeply flawed the case against him really was. George was questioned for hours. The exact details of what happened inside that room are still a mystery because no official records were kept. There was no audio recording. This was 1944. There was no stenographer. And most importantly, George had no parent, no guardian, and no lawyer by his side. It was simply a scared 14-year-old boy, 5 feet tall, up against seasoned law enforcement officers in a deeply segregated southern town. By the end of that interrogation, Sheriff H.S. Newman told the press that George had confessed. According to him, George admitted to luring the girls with an offer to show them flowers, then attacking them with a 15-inch iron railroad spike after they rejected his advances. But here's the problem. No written confession was ever produced. George didn't sign anything. There were no witnesses, other than the officers themselves. The supposed confession lived only in their words. Police claimed George led them to the murder weapon, a railroad spike. But no such weapon was ever entered into evidence. No photos were taken, no forensic tests were done, and no attempt was made to link the weapon to George. Think about that for a moment. In a double murder case, one of the most serious crimes imaginable, the only piece of physical evidence was never preserved. Even if George had held the spike, there were doubts about whether he was physically capable of the crime. Remember, George weighed less than 100 pounds. The girls, Betty June and Mary Emma, were not toddlers. They were 11 and 7 years old. One was nearly George's size. to attack and overpower them both, strike them repeatedly with enough force to fracture their skulls, and then drag their bodies into a ditch. It seemed implausible. Years later, medical experts would confirm this doubt. The autopsy revealed the wounds required significant strength beyond what a small, undernourished child could likely exert. But in 1944, these questions were ignored. Instead of exploring alternative suspects, the investigation quickly zeroed in on George. There were rumors of adults in the area with violent histories. There were whispers that the real killer may have been someone else entirely. But none of those leads were pursued. The case was closed almost as quickly as it had been opened. Within just days, George was indicted for murder. The speed of the investigation must also be seen in the context of 1944 South Carolina. This was a Jim Crow state where racial tensions ran high and violence against black citizens was common. When the girls' bodies were discovered, white citizens were outraged. Some demanded swift justice, others demanded blood. The sheriff knew the community needed a suspect to ease tensions. And George, a poor black teenager, fit the role perfectly. He was vulnerable, he was powerless, and most importantly, he couldn't defend himself. After George's arrest, his parents were told to leave town. Angry crowds had begun to gather outside the jail, and whispers of lynching circulated. To protect their other children, the Stinney family packed up and fled Alcaloo, never to return. George was left entirely alone. He would spend the rest of his short life without the comfort of his mother, father, or siblings. His sister Aim later recalled the pain of that moment. "We couldn't even say goodbye. They took George away, and we never saw him again until the trial." On April 24th, less than a month after the murders, a grand jury of 20 white men indicted George for the murders of Betty June and Mary Emma. There was no defense evidence presented. No witnesses called in George's favor. The decision was unanimous. Proceed to trial. And here's the shocking part. The trial was scheduled almost immediately. George would face a capital trial just 30 days after his arrest. For the families of Betty June and Mary Emma, the grief was unimaginable. Two young girls, full of life, ripped away in the most violent way possible. The community wanted justice for them. But justice requires evidence. Justice requires fairness. Justice requires truth. And in George's case, it seemed like none of those things mattered. What mattered was speed. What mattered was giving the town someone to blame. So here we are, a 14-year-old boy accused of one of the most brutal crimes in the town's history. A boy with no lawyer at the time of his so-called confession. A boy indicted by an all-white jury in a racially segregated South. The stage was set for a trial, but what would happen in that courtroom would be even more shocking than the arrest itself. Soon, we'll take you inside the one-day trial of George Stinney Jr., a trial so rushed, so unfair, that historians today call it one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in American history. To keep up with this series and even more interesting true crime stories that never came to light until now, hit the red subscribe button. Now back to the story. A double murder, a 14-year-old defendant, and a trial that lasted just one day. No defense witnesses, no cross-examination, and a jury that deliberated for only 10 minutes. This wasn't justice, it was a railroad. On April 24th, 1944, barely a month after the murders, George Stinney Jr. was led into a small courthouse in Manning, South Carolina. He was dressed in ill-fitting overalls, his wrists shackled, his head bowed. The courtroom was packed with white citizens, hungry for justice. The families of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames sat in the gallery, their grief heavy in the air. George's family? They weren't there. They had been forced to flee town after his arrest. His mother, father, brothers, and sisters, none of them could risk returning. George walked into that courtroom completely alone. George was assigned a single attorney, Charles Plowden, a tax lawyer with little criminal defense experience. He had no time to prepare, no resources, and no ability to mount a real defense. Plowden did not challenge the confession. He did not call George's sister Aim to testify. She had been with him when the girls rode by, and could have confirmed George's innocence. He did not call medical experts to question whether George was physically capable of committing the crime. Instead, he sat quietly, doing little more than observing. Decades after 1944, George Stinney's name faded into the background of history. In Alcaloo, the crime was rarely spoken about. Families remember the murders of Betty June Binnicker and Mary Emma Thames, but few mention the boy who was executed for it. George's family, however, could never forget. They had been driven from their home, forced to scatter, carrying with them the stigma of being related to a murderer. His sister Aim carried vivid memories of the day George was arrested and the last time she saw him. She insisted until her dying day that George was with her, watching the family's cow, when the girls were killed. She never stopped saying he was innocent. By the 1960s and 70s, as the civil rights movement reshaped America, George's case began to resurface in whispers. Activists pointed to him as one of the youngest people ever executed in the United States. His story became a symbol of how cruel Jim Crow justice could be. Writers, historians, and eventually filmmakers began to take an interest. His story was documented in articles, in legal discussions about juvenile justice, and in debates about the death penalty. Still, his conviction stood. Officially, George was guilty. By the 2000s, George's surviving siblings began actively fighting to clear his name. They gave interviews, worked with lawyers, and reached out to advocacy groups. They described George not as a killer, but as a gentle boy who loved to draw, play with his siblings, and fish in the local streams. They wanted the world to know him as he truly was, not as the monster the newspapers of 1944 had painted. Most importantly, they wanted the record corrected, not just for George, but for themselves. They had lived under the shadow of his conviction for their entire lives. In 2013, 70 years after the trial, attorneys filed a motion with the state of South Carolina to reopen George's case. Their argument was simple. George's conviction and execution had been a miscarriage of justice. They pointed to the coerced confession. With no written statement and no witnesses, there was no proof George ever admitted guilt. Of the lack of evidence, no physical evidence linked him to the murders. The trial itself, a single day, no defense witnesses, no cross-examination, no appeal. At his age, at just 14, George could not have fully understood the charges or the proceedings. The attorneys argued that his rights under the U.S. Constitution had been trampled from the very beginning. In January 2014, a South Carolina court held a hearing on George's case. For the first time in 70 years, evidence and testimony about his trial were publicly examined. His siblings testified, sharing memories of George's whereabouts that day and insisting he had been with the family's cow, not near the ditch where the girls were found. Legal experts explained how his trial violated basic standards of justice. Historians discuss the climate of racism and fear in 1940 South Carolina. Perhaps most haunting were the words of those who described the execution itself, how a boy so small had been strapped into a chair built for men, his mask slipping away as the electricity surged. On December 17, 2014, Circuit Judge Carmen Mullen issued her decision. She vacated George Stinney Jr. as conviction, ruling that his trial had been a fundamental injustice. She cited the lack of defense, the absence of evidence, and the speed of the proceedings as clear proof that George had not received a fair trial. With those words, George was officially exonerated. 70 years after his death, his name was finally cleared. The ruling made national headlines. News outlets across the country revisited George's story, many for the first time. For his surviving family, the decision was bittersweet. They were grateful, relieved, but also deeply pained that it had taken so long, and that George himself had not lived to see his name cleared. Civil rights groups hailed the ruling as a powerful acknowledgement of past wrongs. But they also stressed that George's story was not just history, it was a warning about what happens when fear, prejudice, and injustice take hold of the legal system. George's case now stands as one of the most infamous examples of wrongful conviction in American history. It has been studied in law schools, written about in textbooks, and remembered in documentaries. It raises questions that remain urgent today. Should juveniles ever face the death penalty? How do we protect the rights of the poor and marginalized in a system often stacked against them? How many other George Stinneys have there been? People silenced by rushed trials, weak defenses, and racial prejudice. His story is more than just the tragedy of a boy executed at 14. It is a mirror reflecting America's struggle with justice, race, and truth. For George's siblings, the exoneration provided some measure of healing. They no longer had to live under the shadow of his conviction. They could finally speak of him with pride and love, knowing the world now recognized what they had always known. George was innocent. But the pain never fully faded. They had lost their brother in the most brutal way imaginable. No court ruling could give him back to them. Even today, nearly a century later, George's story leaves us with a chilling question. If a child as young as 14 could be convicted and executed in just 83 days, without evidence or defense, how many others might have been silenced by the same system? His story reminds us of the importance of vigilance, compassion, and fairness in the pursuit of justice. George Stinney Jr. was executed in 1944. His small body strapped into an electric chair built for men. 70 years later, his conviction was overturned. But his story is not just about the past. It is about the present and the future. It is about ensuring that no child, no innocent person, is ever rushed to judgment again. And now, we turn the question to you. Do you believe the justice system has truly learned from George Stinney's case? Or are there still cracks where innocence can slip through? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and what story you would love to see next. If this story sent chills down your spine, don't walk away. Subscribe now and hit the bell. Join us as we uncover the hidden truths behind shocking crimes like this one, and see for yourself how appearances can be deadly deceiving.